Hey everyone, I'm Lou Perez, your host of the Builder Upper Show, a podcast where we talk about everything in construction and trades. Now let's get into it. I would like to welcome our guest, Scott Kimpland, partner at FMI Corporation, based out of Tampa, or at least he's based out of Tampa. Hey Scott, how are you doing today?
Hey Lou, I'm doing great. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you joining. This is a long time coming. We have a lot of communication back and forth through your emails. I subscribe to your newsletter personally because you put out amazing information. I'm like, hey, I got to have this guy on my podcast. He's awesome.
Great. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself, FMI, and what you're all about.
Yeah, let me start with FMI because there's a little bit of ground to cover here, but FMI, we are a management consulting and investment banking firm that specializes in working with the construction industry and the built environment. We started in the early 1950s. We're based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm out of our Tampa office. As you mentioned, we also have an office in Denver and Houston. We pretty much cover the U.S. and do a little bit of international work, some up into Canada. We actually had a Canadian office prior to COVID, but it became kind of hard to work up there. So we service the Canadian market in the work that we do there out of our U.S. But there's really two sides to FMI. At a high level, one side of our business is what we call FMI Capital Advisors. Think of an M&A firm, pretty much seller rep. We transact more construction-related businesses than anybody in the U.S. Typically, that's seller representations in most cases, and we're doing a lot of ESOP representations, ESOP transactions as well. That's become a really hot topic in the industry the last few years. A lot of compelling reasons to consider an ESOP. So that side of the business is all about transactions. It's for people looking to buy, to get in, to get out of the construction industry. Any given time, that business is typically about half of what we do. I sit on the other side of the organization, on the consulting side. Pretty traditional management consulting business. We've got a number of practices, which I'll kind of run through here with you. And then I'll talk a little bit about where I fit into that structure and what my specific area of expertise within FMI is. But we've got a handful of practice areas, one being what we call our strategy and research group. So think about companies trying to figure out, strategic plans, where to play, how to play, where the world's going in the next 3 to 5 years. We do a ton of work with larger companies around strategy. We have a pretty robust research group that brings a lot of research to the table. So the strategy we're doing is not really a dozen smart people sitting around a table saying, hey, what do you think we ought to do? But it's based on research and kind of data driven. I work in a group called the Performance Practice. And in that practice, there's really kind of two key service offerings. One is our compensation practice. So we do a lot of compensation benchmarking, incentive comp plan development, long-term deferred comp plans, those sorts of things, golden handcuff plans, all of it being in the construction sector, most of it being for contractors. I kind of specialize in the second area under performance, which we call operational improvement. Most of the people I work with and the team that I work with are focused on labor-intensive, self-performing contractors, mostly trade contractors, specialty contractors, but anybody with a lot of labor on their payroll, just helping them become more effective on the operational side of their business and helping them get better at managing the largest controllable cost in their business, which is labor. We'll talk more about that as we continue the discussions here, but that's really my background, is just helping labor-intensive contractors become more effective on the operation side of their business. We've got another practice area built around leadership development. So think of all things soft skills, training, management, leadership development for construction companies, really kind of focus on C-suite level, from CEO level down to really frontline field leaders, foremen, superintendents.
Yep.
And that group also does a fair amount of management succession consulting with companies trying to figure out who's the next generation of leaders in our business? How do we get them prepared? What are their gaps? We do a lot of work in that area. And then layered over top of that, we have about 40 active contractor peer groups of various trades, anywhere from general contractors. We've got a couple of civil contracting groups. I specifically lead 3 drywall framing groups and a large mechanical group. And at any given time, like I said, we've got about 40 of those groups going on. Most of those groups have anywhere from about 6 to 8 non-competing companies from different parts of the country that are kind of similar size, similar sophistication, that really just kind of learn and share with each other. And then as a partner in the firm, I sit on several ESOP board of directors. I've gotten kind of a little expertise in that the last few years. And so I sit on a couple of contractor boards, and some of those are fiduciary boards. Some of them are just purely advisory boards. So that's a little bit about FMI and what we do. All of that is within the built environment, and most of it is with contractors, a fair amount also with building product manufacturers, those sorts of people that kind of play in our industry.
That's amazing. The value that you guys bring to those contractors. How many times do you guys meet with the peer groups? Is there like a structured meeting type of situation?
Yeah, the peer groups, typically there's a couple of different formats, but primarily these are all CEOs, presidents. They're all decision makers that are in these groups. Most of the groups kind of meet on a twice-a-year cadence. Usually it's kind of a spring. We're just now coming up on our spring meetings. I've got 4 meetings. Actually, starting next week, I've got a meeting a week for the next 4 weeks with my 4 groups. And then we'll meet again in the fall. And so that's kind of a twice a year. There's a couple of other variations on that where we'll do what's called parallel meetings. And those companies might bring, for example, their CFOs to a meeting. We'll meet, we'll kind of meet with them in a parallel meeting, or their field ops leaders, that sort of thing.
Do the contractors need to be FMI clients? Like, how do they get into this peer group situation? I know there's a lot of contractors that I've spoken to in the past, and have even came on the Builder Upper show, where they're either interested in peer groups or they rely heavily on peers to grow their business. What's the situation if a contractor is watching this right now? Like, how do they get involved?
Yeah, great question. I would say the majority of companies that are in our groups, a fair amount of them come from our consulting business. They've known FMI, they've done work with us. We know a little bit about them. We know that they would be a good peer member, because the ability to both contribute and benefit from the group is really important. But a lot of them are just long-term FMI clients that we've done other consulting work with. And there's a fair amount of folks that really have just kind of come in from the outside without experience with FMI. Our target market, I would tell you, tends to be kind of middle market and above. So for trade contractors, for example, a small client for us would be 50 million a year in revenue, probably 15 million or more in field labor spend or labor cost. Our sweet spot, I would say, for trade contractors is probably more in the 80 to $300 million a year range. And then for general contractors, it's more like the $500 million to several $1 billion general contractor. So we tend to play in what we call the middle market and upper market in the industry. Okay. But yeah, people can reach out. We're not always in the process of forming new peer groups. Once you get 6 or 8 companies, these groups tend to stay together. My group that I'll be meeting with in 2 weeks, that group has actually been together 24 years. I've been with them the entire time. 2 of the companies have actually transitioned leadership twice over that time frame. But it's a great group of drywall companies. Some of the most they're just some of the best firms in the industry leaders, some of the biggest firms in the industry in that group. But it's a great group of organizations, really high performing companies.
It's interesting because these companies, you laid it out pretty clear, right? So mid-size to larger specialty trade contractors. Can you share a bit about how you work with them? Like, how do you help them with where they're at today?
Yeah, so I'll speak specifically kind of around our operational practice and where my expertise is. But for most of those firms, most of our clients are actually good clients trying to become great clients. Good companies trying to become great companies, or they're great companies trying to stay out ahead of the rest of the pack. We don't tend to focus on and work with broken companies. We're not a turnaround firm. That's not really our market. So most of ours are clients that are just trying to stay relevant in the industry. They are, I would call them, they have somewhat of a growth mindset. And I'm not talking about in terms of growth of top line, but just growth in terms of staying out ahead of the rest of the pack. They're lifelong learners, most of them. They're people that welcome outside insights. And, I always tell people, FMI, we're not smarter than anybody, but we get to work with a lot of really high performing firms. And over time, you begin to kind of see what average looks like. You begin to see a few underperforming firms, and then you see the best of the best. And, we're able to kind of use that lens of industry best of the best to kind of evaluate our clients and help them identify, where are the opportunities in their business, to improve performance, to continue to grow, to continue to learn. And we've got kind of an approach or process on the ops side that we use to kind of work with those firms. It starts with an assessment up front of just understanding where are they. Why, I always tell people, you're perfectly designed for your current level of results, right? So there's a reason why you're getting your current level results. And if you want to kind of raise the bar and get to the next level, you got to figure out what are the levers that we need to pull and what are the things that we need to work on.
I'm curious. So you have the opportunity to work with industry leading trade contractors. What have you learned about what separates the industry leaders from the peers and competitors?
Great question. One is just that growth mindset. They're not, they welcome outside ideas and influence. A lot of these firms I mentioned, I'm on a couple of boards. Some of these are fiduciary boards, but I've got a number of clients who just put together advisory boards with a few outsiders on it. But they're willing to take outside input. They're willing to kind of bring other people in their organization that has different experiences that can bring ideas and new thinking. So they're open to that. They have a growth mindset. They tend to never be satisfied with their current level results, right? Even if they're very high performing companies, they're always looking at how do we continue to improve? How do we get a little bit better, incrementally better every day, and never feel like they've quite arrived. So those are kind of characteristics of them. And then, really three things come to mind that differentiate. They're fairly process oriented. They're very focused on consistency in terms of how they operate and how they utilize process. And they're very disciplined, right? They stick to what they're good at, and they follow the process when times are good, when times are bad.
I guess that would be like, that actually brings up my next question. The genesis of the relationship of FMI and the contractor when you're evaluating that contractor, and what are some of the first areas you look at to understand how healthy the business really is?
Yep. Yeah, we have a process, and it's there's really four components that we always start with, what we call an operational needs assessment. And what we're looking at there is strategy. Do they have a viable strategy? Do they know what they're good at? Do they know what they're not good at? Are they selective in the work that they choose to pursue? So we're looking at kind of just their overall strategy. Are they trying to be all things to all people, or do they have a fairly defined strategy? We're looking at leadership and culture, right? There's a lot of correlation between just leadership and culture to these higher performing firms. Is it a healthy culture? Is it a field focused culture? Do they understand that where they really make their money is in the field? And, does everybody else understand that, hey, our job is really to support the heck out of the field and put people in the best position to be productive and successful? So, those are kind of cultural elements that we look at. We'll look at some performance metrics, just looking back at their financial performance over the last 4 to 5 years, comparing it to similar size type firms. We've got a lot of data. We have a lot of financial data just because of the bandwidth we have in the industry. We can kind of see, are they financially performing, are the key ratios, best of class? Are they trending the right direction over time? We look at how do they perform relative to their cost budgets, right? We do something called a completed contracts analysis, and we basically take every project they've completed the last 2 to 3 years, we put it in a big tool that we use, and we slice it and dice it 100 different ways by project type, project size. But one of the things, Lou, that we're really looking for out of all that is if you took, a big portfolio of completed work, on average, how much do you overrun or underrun each one of your direct cost estimates? So on labor, are you consistently able to hit or meet or beat your labor budget? Are you consistently able to meet or beat or hit your material budget? So we look at all those cost items, and that gives us a lot of insight into kind of their ability to not only estimate accurate direct cost on bid day, but also it gives us real insight of, are they capable of consistently managing and executing work at or as good as budget, right? So we're looking at a lot of things. We're looking at process around planning. How do they get their projects out of the hands of the men and women who got it, i.e. estimating? How do they get that in the hands of the people that have to go build it, their operational people, their project management, their field leaders? That whole pre-planning and transition from estimating to ops is a very critical step where there's a lot of opportunity to enhance margin. There's a lot of opportunity to drop the ball, and a lot really depends on how well prepared are your field managers and leaders when you put them in the field. Do they know the scope? Do they know the production expectations? Do they know which direction we're going, how we're tracking the job? But the more those field leaders know before they hit the job, the better chance they have of effectively managing, controlling labor and productivity. So we're looking at planning processes, measurement and feedback processes. Are foremen getting regular feedback on how they're doing compared to where they should be? I always like to use a golf analogy. This is a great analogy, but you think about it, when you go out golfing with your buddies, you jump in the golf cart and you look down, and the first thing you see on the steering wheel of the golf cart is what? What's on the golf cart steering wheel before you even take off? There's a pencil and there's a scorecard, right?
Yeah, scorecard.
Yeah, and if you look at the bottom of that scorecard, it's going to tell you on most golf courses it's 72. You've got 72 strokes to get around this. That's par. But not only that, it kind of breaks down every step of this golf course. So the first hole is a par 4. The second hole is a par 3. The third hole is a par 5. And as you complete every one of those pieces of the golf course, what are you doing as you're leaving the first hole and going to the second hole, right? You're plugging in your actual score against par on that first hole. So at any given time, am I 2 over? Am I 2 under? How aggressive can I be on this next hole based on how I'm doing? But I'm a big believer that if you want the people in the field, your field leadership, to worry about and control labor, you better be giving them very regular feedback in a very simple, meaningful way, so they know the score at any given time. And it amazes me in this industry how many hundreds of millions of dollars of labor are being managed out there today, and the foremen have no idea where they're at on the golf course. If they're lucky, they get finished and somebody says, "Hey, you shot an 82 today," and there's nothing you can do about it at that point, and the game is over. But that's a big one. That's a big one that we look for, is just how focused and how informed are the people who manage your labor on a day-to-day basis? Are they on where they're at?
That was a great analogy.
Thanks.
That was
people
very
love
well.
That one.
I might steal that next time I go talk to somebody. But that was amazing. And
and coming off this weekend with the Masters, I don't know if you watched the ending of that, but you could kind of watch going into the last few holes, with a two-stroke lead, can I be a little bit aggressive? Or, hey, with two-stroke lead, I can actually bogey this last hole, right, and still win the tournament. And so, that I just find that's a great analogy. But in the absence of the score, it's hard to expect those field leaders to really manage labor and to manage productivity.
Oh, wow. I like that. Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with that analogy, actually. That's good. No, I really like it. So, I mean, you were talking a little bit more about that operational success. If you had to pick 3 or 4 drivers, no pun intended on the golf analogy, but what would that be? Or what would they be?
Yeah, it's probably hard to narrow it down to 2 or 3, and it's a little bit different depending on the company. Some companies are doing certain things well, other areas they need help. But I would tell you, I would tell you that having process around keeping your field leaders who manage labor informed on how they're doing on productivity or labor versus par and where they should be at any given time, that's definitely a top 3. In the absence of that information, they're just going to continue to manage in the field to the best they can. And, whatever the results end up being, they end up being, and you see the score at the end of the game. So that's definitely a top 3 priority. I would also tell you that we have typically found too that whole process up front and getting a job transitioned out of estimating into the hands of the people that have to build it, your PMs and your field leaders, that's a critical place where I think there's always a lot of leverage and opportunity. And generally the way I like to think about that is, and there's probably an exception to this, I haven't found it yet, but generally the earlier and the deeper your field leader is involved in a new project, the less labor they're going to typically spend on that project. The flip side is a scenario where, hey, the foreman walks through the office one day and somebody throws a set of plans and specs to him and says, hey, Joe, you're 3 weeks behind, you better get busy. And, that's a bit exaggerated, but there's actually a lot of companies that's how they actually get started. And so that foreman goes out there day one. He's under live fire by the time he gets out there. And, there's no way at that point you can back up and recapture that planning that could have been done or should have been done. So he's just kind of he's only able to fight fires and react at that point, right? So the pre-planning is a really big one as well. The third one that I'll throw in there, which I've learned a lot about, FMI's learned a lot about the last few years, but if you look at our most operationally successful clients right now, one of the characteristics that we have seen the last few years, especially as the market's been pretty good, is their discipline and rigor around being able to say no to a good customer with a bad opportunity or a bad project. And so it's that ability to be disciplined on which projects you choose to pursue, which ones you say no to. That's really hard for a contractor to do, is to turn down an opportunity. But if, for example, it's an opportunity that requires an A team to manage it, maybe it's a big, complicated, fast-paced job, and your 2 A teams are already tied up on existing projects that are going to be ongoing, you might not have the right team to manage that job, right? It probably behooves you to, really question, should we pursue this thing? Or it's a good client that's trying to get you to a specific price, and the economics just don't work, right? You've gone through, your direct cost, you've got a good estimate, and you just can't get to a price that's going to work for you. But the ability to say no to a bad opportunity with a good client, or I guess say no to a bad opportunity with a bad client as well, right? But the ability to be selective in your work acquisition, we are finding, is something that really differentiates the best of the best from kind of the average contractors out there.
I guess I could assume or guess that the opposite would be the mistakes, but I guess I would rather hear it directly from you. What are some of the most common operational mistakes that you see contractors make that hold them back?
Yeah, the one thing that we see that probably gets more contractors just in trouble is, it goes back to that project selectivity. It's focus on top line revenue versus bottom line profitability. You know, a good example, you walk into somebody's office, Lou, and you see, you know how E&R does, what is it, their top 600 specialty contractors every year and their top 100 general contractors. And you see these plaques hanging in their lobby. And last year they were number 247 on the E&R 600 list. And you know, one of their goals this year is, hey, we're going to get to 225, but they get real focused on top line. And Doc Fales, our founder, used to do a famous speech. It's still talked about today. And the title of the speech was "Volume Kills, Profit Thrills." But if you talk to anybody that's been in the banking industry around construction for a long time, they will tell you that many, many more contractors get in trouble having too much work than having not enough work. And you know, reflecting on that, I've been in this business right now, coming up on 39 years. I cannot ever remember a company I've worked with that went out of business because they did not have enough work. Now, I've seen it get ugly where the president, you know, had to lay a bunch of people off and became a project manager and estimator, but somehow they were able to scale the business and get, you know, the cost structure to a point where, you know, it made sense with the revenue they had. I will tell you, I couldn't count how many contractors I've seen get into trouble or go out through the top, right? They took on too many jobs. Cash flow became an issue. Maybe they were profitable, but cash flow became an issue. You know, they had a general contractor that something happened to on a job. And so, you know, they had a ton of money or something tied up on that or a big claim that they just couldn't weather the storm. But many more contractors get in trouble going out through the top versus not having enough work. So that's a huge one.
Wow. You know, I trying to think about, you know, success, and a lot of it I feel like also comes down to what happens in the field. The field is near and dear close to my heart because I was a field worker as well. That's where I started. My career in construction is picking up the hammer. And then, so my son, just yesterday, so he's graduating high school, and
Awesome.
he just applied at like 4 different electrical contractors, some union, some non-union. So he's trying to get his hands dirty and go into the electrical world. He sees the big opportunity with data centers and everything. So he's like, I see a future in construction. I can see a lot of, like, you know, stability in the industry. So that's where he's going. So I always think, like, okay, how important, and when I'm thinking about the field, how important, and coming from you, is field leadership to operational excellence? You know, what do the best leaders do differently?
Yeah, great question, right? There's no substitute for great leadership and great talent, whether it's in the field, whether it's in the office, whether it's in senior management. You know, field leadership's critical. And by the way, you know, the electrical trade for your son, that's a great choice. I just think, you know, for young people right now, that's a heck of an opportunity and a career opportunity for him. So kudos to him. We need more young people like that. Field leadership's great, but I will also tell you this: our field's only as good as we support them, right? I mean, you can have the most talented, trained, qualified leadership, you know, motivated, ready to go to work. But if we don't get the right materials in front of them at the right time, if we don't get the right answers to the right questions to them. And so field leadership's absolutely critical. But we also, you know, if you think about it, I'll kind of share another little analogy I like to use. But if you think about it, the only thing your customers in this industry pay you for is when you install units of work. Right. So at the end of the month, you basically go and look at, you know, how much of the work's installed, what % complete are we, you know, what can we bill them for on the schedule of values. But the only thing customers pay you for is units of work installed, whether it's, you know, lineal feet of framing, you know, the amount of drywall you've hung, you know, how much conduit you've run, whatever. That's all you get paid for is widgets of work installed. And so you think about that, the only people in your company that actually do anything that the customer pays you directly for is your craft level, field level worker, right? And I always ask people, why do all the other folks in the business exist? You've got project managers who are never going to install a widget at work. You have field leaders who may not be working superintendents or foremen, right? They're planning, they're directing out there, but they're not actually installing. You've got an estimating department, you've got an accounting department. Why do all those folks exist? And it's really simple. Their purpose is to put the craft people in the best possible position to support them so they can install as many widgets per man hour as they can possibly get, right? Our job is just to set them up to win. And so field leadership, very important. And again, I think you'll see a correlation between how projects perform and the quality of leadership. But I also think it's really incumbent on all the other people in the organization to understand that, hey, our role, our jobs here is to support the heck out of that crew and to support the field. And, that leads me to kind of one of the skills that I think a field leader has to be really good at. The only way we can support those folks and make sure they've got the right materials, the right tools, the right equipment, the right information at the right time is a good field leader has to be planning far enough in advance and communicating those needs to the rest of the organization early enough so that we can do a good job of supporting them, right? And so, when you think about good field leadership, I think one of the skills that I would really highlight is the ability to kind of get out ahead, not just think about what am I going to be doing the next 2 or 3 weeks and when am I going to be doing it, but to really build a shopping list of what are the materials, what are the tools, what's the equipment, what's the information or answers that I need from my project manager to effectively execute this work in the next few weeks, where my crew isn't running out of stuff, or my crew's not having to run to Home Depot or the supply house or the warehouse every day. That's usually a great indicator. To me, if you want to get an indication of how effective your field leader is, look at how many emergency last-minute calls they're having to make to their shop, their warehouse, trip to the supply house, Home Depot. That's a great indicator of planning. And one of the mistakes that I see a lot of companies make is they take their best tradesperson and they say, hey, Lou, you've been a great electrician. We're going to make you a foreman on the next job. And they understand the electrical trade inside and out. They can build anything, but they've never been taught to plan. They've never been taught, how do you manage and lead people? They've never been formally taught, how do you communicate? And so, that's all stuff that an organization really needs to be teaching and training these technical people how to do. And to their defense, a lot of organizations ignore that. They just assume that, hey, we promoted you, that by osmosis, you're going to figure out how to be a great planner. You're going to be a great communicator. You're going to be a great motivator of people. All those are skills that, quite frankly, most trade people, never learn. They learn the skills of the trade, right? And so you're taking very technical, hands-on people and you're putting them in this role where they have to understand all these things. But, we don't do a good job of preparing for that. And one of the areas I mentioned, our organizational leadership and organizational development group, we are doing a lot of what I would just call tailored management and leadership development for field level leaders. So we've got clients that, they may have 20 field leaders that they say, hey, we want to teach these folks some management and leadership skills. We'll come in, we'll tailor a series very specific to what skills they're trying to teach them. We'll lay that over time, but we do a lot of that kind of development to teach those technical field folks, what it means to be a leader and how to lead.
Amen to supporting the field workers. I'm with you on that fully. Yep. And then I was going to ask you that you actually answered my follow-up question. Does FMI get involved to help out those situations when that time arises? So I'm glad that you highlighted that that's something that FMI is capable of doing, stepping in and preparing that next phase of the craft worker's career.
Yeah, we've got some very talented and gifted trainers. I'm more of a consultant. I spend probably 80% of my time working with clients in their offices on process, rolling it out, following up on it, figuring out what levers to pull. But we've got a really talented group of trainers. All they know is the construction industry. So, all their examples are construction specific. You can go out and get great leadership training at a lot of places. But I will tell you, you ought to understand this coming from the field. if you put someone in front of a group of field people in this industry, they've got about 3 minutes to have credibility or not, right? And those folks can tell, do they really understand the environment that I'm in? Do they understand my world? And I will tell you, that's one of the areas that we really can differentiate as a company, because all of our people, they only work in the construction industry. They understand, they have empathy for the field guys. They understand the environment they're in. They understand what they're up against, the conditions they're in. And so we're able to deliver that training using hands-on examples. It's not death by PowerPoint. It's little building exercises where they have a project they have to construct, and they learn what we're trying to teach through hands-on things. But we try to make it as close to their real world and understanding their environment as we can.
I like that. You can throw some Legos into the mix and make them project manage.
We got plenty of Legos and little building games and little case studies, role plays, all those kind of things that, try to simulate as close as you can the actual things they run into out in the field.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. I actually just talked to another contractor the other day out in Texas, and he was talking a lot about productivity, but not a lot of contractors that talk about productivity actually do anything to improve it. What does real productivity improvement actually look like in practice?
Yeah, great question. I think, one of the things I always tell people is focusing on productivity, you're at the wrong end of the pipeline, right? Productivity is a byproduct. It's a result. And if you're focusing just on measuring productivity and kind of that end of the pipeline, you're missing all the things that ultimately contribute to productivity, right? Reduce labor, allow you to get more widgets per man hour. Now, I'm not telling you not to measure productivity. You need to. But you also need to kind of really identify, in most labor intensive firms, I'll tell you, there usually ends up being about 6 to 7 things that ultimately really drive labor and how effectively you manage labor. And they're very process oriented things. I've mentioned some already. What work and what projects you choose to pursue on the front end. There's certain kinds of work that every contractor is good at, they're productive at, it's their sweet spot. There's other kinds of work that they're not good at, that they shouldn't pursue. So your process around work selection, all those processes we mentioned around pre-job planning and getting jobs from estimating to ops, you can see in companies that are very rigorous and disciplined around handing off projects and how they do that. So it looks and feels very similar. How companies track and provide feedback on labor and productivity is another process we mentioned. The field planning is another area. Depending on the kind of companies, MEP firms, drywall firms, prefab continues to be a driver, right? The more that we can take out of the field, the rain, the sleet, the snow, the mud, and build it in a controlled environment, we're seeing huge breakthroughs in terms of just labor impact by doing that. And we're actually seeing more and more trades that, 10 years ago, if you would have told me, hey, you're going to see a drywall contractor using prefab, I kind of would have questioned that. But we're seeing all kinds of trades figure out how to bring stuff inside a more controlled environment. You're going to continue to see that one accelerate even more just because of the workforce shortages and, other issues out there. So productivity, when you see it, what you really notice is the processes are in place. People understand the processes. There's an expectation that people follow the processes, and the focus is on kind of doing all those small things upstream correctly, so that the result is just good productivity on the back end. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And
Yeah.
something that you pointed out was like tracking the information, even previously, units of measure and just tracking labor in general. If a contractor is evaluating any type of software or technology, can they reach out to FMI for assistance or guidance when they're, really looking at their internal software and processes?
That's one area that we have talked a lot about strategically of getting in the game. We've intentionally stayed away from it. We're fairly software agnostic.
Nice.
And couple things there. I always tell people, if you're going to build a process, build it manually first, right? Make sure you've got the process, that manually you can make it work, that you've got behaviors that, for example, job cost, right? You can have the best job cost system in the world, but if you can't break jobs down into bite-sized pieces, get people to report at that level of detail, so much of that gets down to, who's providing the inputs, the quality of, data, how people code their time, how they report, work installed. That sometimes I think people think that technology is going to fix the problem. If you have a broken process, all that technology is going to do is speed up the mess, right? It's going to report crappy inputs faster. And so, we don't do a lot of work. There's some great technologies out there. That's not really in our sweet spot. We've got some resources that we will typically point clients to that live in that world every day. Software is changing every day. That's the other reason, is you have to be in that world every day because there's something new, something's changing. And so the people that are really good at it, they live that stuff every day. And that's just not something we've got enough bandwidth to cover.
I think that's super important for people to understand, is making sure that they know what their processes are. And the only way that you know your process is if you can actually do it manually.
Yeah.
So, so if you can break it all the way down to the nuts and bolts, then you actually know how to tell somebody that's even trying to sell you software how everything works.
Absolutely. Right. If you can't sit down and kind of flow chart the process, and get some map of, what's first, what's second, what are the inputs. That's kind of step one, is just get the people to think through. I've got clients that have great job cost systems. And what happens is, it's producing all this information. And then you go out to the field and find out that nobody's sitting down and even talking about that with the foreman every week. Right. And so, they've got the tools, they've got the technology, but there's a broken step in the process that nobody's ever kind of really focused on. So the information's not getting down to the people that need to know it. So, but I would tell you this, the software firms that seem to be focusing on labor, they seem to be focusing on, productivity. That's where this business makes it. And we see a lot of cool technology out there, but when you kind of strip it all back, you just say, hey, this is kind of cool, but how is this impacting performance? My advice to the software people is, you need to really understand what problem are we solving, be able to articulate that very clearly, and what's the value to the contractor. And contractors are very results oriented. They are very tangible, results oriented people. They leave a project every day. They can look back and see progress. If you can't translate that value proposition easily and clearly to their business, it's just always, it's kind of a disconnect. But if you've got a great product that solves a great problem and you can communicate it, I think there's solid opportunity there.
Totally agree with you.
Yeah.
There's, you come across some of these softwares and you could tell that these people probably didn't come from construction. So,
yeah. I'm probably getting, Lou, I probably get 3 calls or contacts a month. Most of it's through my LinkedIn post. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. If you don't follow me on LinkedIn, go there and follow me. That's a shameless plug for that.
Hey, it works.
But I'll get software firms I've never heard of that will reach out to me. And usually the first question, if I get on a call with them, I'll ask them is, hey, what problem are you solving? I would tell you 50% of them really stumble with that question. They can't articulate that in less than 2-minute elevator pitch, right? And what's the value proposition to the contractor is kind of the second question. But those are things. And so I see a lot of technology, and a lot of these people are working with other people's money. So they're, there's good out there, but there's a lot of stuff you got to weed through. And unfortunately, that's created a lot of noise for trade contractors to weed through to figure out, the few software solutions that are really viable and really helpful for my business. They're almost paralyzed because there's a different option coming at them every week.
I feel bad for those guys in California. They probably get cold called to no
Yeah.
avail. They probably know every single software that's out there.
I'll usually listen to those people, on an initial call, because I found some pretty cool stuff. There's some things out there, there's some AI stuff that's coming down the pipe that's legit AI stuff that first glance, there might be something there. I think we're very close to having some big breakthroughs. But there's a handful of things that I'm a big fan of. And if I've got a client that I know very well, I'll typically steer them to say, hey, you might want to go look at this. I think it's pretty good. And usually, I'll wait till 3 or 4 clients give me feedback. And if I get thumbs up from 3 or 4 contractors that say this works, that's usually a really good sign, because they're pretty tough. If you can make a trade contractor happy and make their software, work for them or help them make it work, there's probably something to it.
I'm with you. The AI boom and everything, I feel like there is something to a product or an offering that doesn't have to rip and replace what you currently have, but actually is more of like a stitch and grow. And you can use certain tools out there, AI tools, to just kind of have a value add on your current processes, and you're taking little manual pieces away slowly, but not having to overhaul an entire tech stack.
Yeah.
I think that's coming down.
The other challenge with it is, you probably see this with your construction clients, there's not a lot of standardization in this industry. Every contractor does it differently. And, the way you break your jobs down looks different than mine. And because we're a very fragmented industry, finding something that you can get, mass around people kind of all agreeing this makes sense. That's a challenge sometimes in this business.
Totally agree. So when it comes to operational improvement, coming down to better process, how much of it comes down to people, leadership, and accountability?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a couple things. I always kind of believe if you've got great people, you can overcome average to less than average process. Great people just figure stuff out, right? And I've even seen that in companies that don't even have a well-defined structure, org structure. They just have some great people, and they just figure stuff out, and they just get it done. Unfortunately, great people are only a percentage of the population, right? We have to kind of deal with averages. But good people are critical. I think if I had to prioritize it, if I was a contractor, those with the best talent ultimately win. And I'm talking about from CEO level down to field level leadership. They're going to win over the long term. The flip side, I think you can have great process, but have less than average talent or bad talent. And I don't think good process will overcome bad talent. It will certainly help it, right? It'll kind of bring you up a level, but I don't think there's a substitute for certain types of DNA in people in this business. You look at the people that are successful at every level, CEO, middle management. There's just a DNA that runs through the most successful. They've got grit. They hate losing. They have a high motor. They just figure things out. We were talking about this a while back at FMI, but we were kind of talking about March of 2020 when the world COVID hit, and we went from completely normal world to the next week. Wait a minute, we can't even get on an airplane to go see our clients. What's going to happen to our business? Our clients are thinking we can't even get on a job site. The world's on its head. But if you look at our industry, within about a week, remember, we'd never heard of Zoom. We'd never heard of Teams. We'd never heard of any of that stuff. All of a sudden, people had figured out, how do we use video conferencing, just like you and I are doing here? How do we work around these? But this industry is just built with people who are problem solvers, and particularly at the trade contractor level. These are the guys that ultimately have to get it built with, a half-baked set of plans and, bad information. But trade contractors, and that's actually one of the things that's kind of kept me interested and involved in this industry. The people that are in it, they're incredible. They solve problems, they overcome, but somehow they get these jobs built, and with a lot of headwinds in many cases, right?
Yeah, you could go back to all of your clients. It'd be interesting to profile them and figure out which ones were the Lego builders, which ones were in competitive sports.
Yeah.
How can you tell that somebody is destined for greatness based off of how they grew up? It seems like there is some sort of something that was built into their DNA, but also their lifestyle and their, what they grew up with to get to where they're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. My generation, there's not a whole lot of us still left in the industry, but we grew up in the hands-on, right? We, in high school, kids were, they were either into muscle cars, it was the Camaros, Trans Ams. They built stuff with their hands. We built forts as kids, but we did a lot of that, and I do think there's definitely something to that, because I've got clients that will actively recruit talent in kind of blue collar areas, farm. You find a kid that grew up on a farm, they can fix anything. They've got a work ethic that won't quit. You find somebody that's played sports at a pretty high level for a long period of time, college sports, whether it's a team sport or an individual sport. They've been knocked down, they've been cussed out by the coach, they've been benched. They were in the weight room training at 6 a.m. while, most of us are sleeping off, a hangover or something. But those things, I'm a big fan of that. And I think, those things do translate to our industry very well.
Yeah, it's that discipline, that rigor. I think you even mentioned that previously. It really sticks out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why do so many contractors struggle to make positive change stick? Like, even when they know what needs to improve?
Great question, Lou. I will tell you, and this is an area where actually I think what I do and what our team at FMI does, this is where we bring a lot of value. Understand there's no silver bullets to productivity or ops improvement. It's not, there's no secret out there. These are meat and potatoes. They're blocking and tackling, planning, communication, measurement, feedback. There's no secret out there, right? So it's not the process that's the trick. The trick is, how do you get a company with 30 or 40 field leaders who have been doing it his or her way for 30 years and been successful? You got to change behavior. And I always tell people, process changes very easily. You can put a half dozen people around a table in an hour to whip up a pretty good looking process around whatever. Behavior changes very slowly. And as human beings, we are wired to naturally resist change, right? I mean, using your example, I know what drives me being healthy. It's diet and exercise. But does that mean I work out every day and I eat great every day? Right? We kind of know the right things to do, but behavioral change is really hard. And what I found is contractors are good at building, right? They can build anything. That's what their expertise is. They're not experts in change management. And there are, change management is a profession. There's people that study this stuff and understand it. There's nuance to it. How do you roll out new things to people? And how do you do that in a way that increases the likelihood that they buy into it, that they accept it, that they use it? And a big part of what we do in our operational practice at FMI is we understand, as you roll out change and implement things in your organization, how do you do that in a way that increases the likelihood that it's going to stick, it's going to work, and it's going to be kind of long-term and sustainable? So short answer to your question is, contractors are really good at building stuff. They are not trained or versed in change management. And most change initiatives, if you kind of go look at the research, most of them fail in our industry or out of our industry just because people don't understand the basics of change management.
So it sounds like, Scott Kimpland is the trainer, is the physical trainer, whatever, any diet, nutrition, and what those contractors need to do in order to get in shape. So you guys will go in and throw away the Oreos, throw away the Doritos, get rid of all the nasty stuff, and teach them how to maintain that right diet so that they become in that tip top shape where they should be. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. We actually become personal trainers, right? And we know the right things to do to be healthy, but I can tell you, when you have to show up at the gym at 5:30 every morning because your trainer's there waiting for you, there's a level of accountability. And a lot of times we end up being kind of that outside accountability. They're investing good money. We don't come inexpensively, and there's a cost for us to be there. So there's some accountability to it. The other thing is, and I think you can relate to this, contractors by nature are very impatient. They think, hey, we come up with a process, we tell people what to do, and tomorrow everybody in the organization just lines up and starts doing it. Human behavior doesn't work like that. And so we're able to kind of bring some discipline to helping them understand that this is going to take a period of time. Not everybody's going to get on board at the same velocity. And helping them understand there's a level of patience that's required if you really want these processes to stick, and if you want them to become muscle memory. And I can't remember, there's some data out there around, you have to do a new behavior a certain number of times or reps before it becomes muscle memory, right? And so part of our job is to kind of help people through that period of natural pushback and resistance to change until these processes become almost muscle memory. And people just say, hey, this is just how we run the business. This is the expectation. And I'm about to start my job. I'm expecting, this planning to take place. And it just, that stuff takes, it's not unusual for us to work with these clients for 15 to 18 months, just getting, 4 or 5 key processes really implemented. But we'd rather have 4 or 5 things really well implemented than to throw 12 things against the wall and hope a few of them stick.
Man, if I was going back to contractor days, I would pull in FMI as my personal trainer. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot that you can feel like you're accountable, like you actually have to do it. You're dishing out the money. You got to make greatness. You got to do it. You got to succeed. There's no other way. I mean, you put yourself in that spot. People talk about wanting to be successful all the time, but what are they doing to be successful?
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things, Lou, translate to just our personal lives, right? If you look at the people that are, have healthy relationships, healthy bodies, they're disciplined. There's certain small behaviors, around building a personal relationship with somebody. You got to spend time with them. You've got to reach out to them when you haven't heard from them before. But it's a bunch of small behaviors done really consistent that create kind of, I don't know if you've read any of James Clear leadership stuff, but James Clear, I love him. And he's so practical, but he talks about just stacking a bunch of very small behaviors on top of each other. And at some point you kind of get the compound interest effect where all those small behaviors stacked on top of each other, diet, exercise, going to the gym, when you do enough of those things enough times, the result starts to hockey stick, right? You start seeing huge return on and it's the same way with this operational stuff and this productivity stuff. It takes a while to get the flywheel turning, but you get these behaviors going, they become a little bit more muscle memory. And then you start to kind of see out the back end, better results on your project, more consistent results on your projects, less risk. That's really kind of, the magic of what we do on the operations side.
Man, Scott, I feel like you could provide golden nuggets all day long. I feel like I could just sit here and continue to ask you questions. So I appreciate you providing all this information. If you had to sum up what it takes to achieve operational excellence, do you have any words of wisdom for our listeners?
Yeah, I think, most companies, if they knew how to get there, they would have done it. And I don't want this to sound self-serving, but, get a personal trainer, get somebody that has helped somebody on this journey before. It might be an employee that's done this somewhere else. It might be an FMI, somebody that helps a lot of companies go through this process and knows how to do it, that has kind of the workout routine and the diet regimen to make it work. But don't be afraid to get outside help. And I think a lot of contractors, there's our clients are people who they're actually looking for outside help. They want people that are smarter than them or people that have just seen a lot of different things. I think there's a lot of contractors that feel like it's a weakness if they reach out and ask somebody outside of their business for insights or for help. And that, to me, it's not a weakness. It's, the best professional athletes, if you look at them, they actually the ones that have the most coaches, right? They'll have a hitting coach, they'll have a diet coach, they'll have an exercise coach, but don't see it as a weakness to ask for help or get help outside. Same with the peer groups, right? They're just getting input from other people that do the same thing they do, and they're willing to listen to it.
I really like that you kind of just open the door. Don't be afraid to ask for help. A lot of people are genuine people and will offer up that help or mentorship that people need. I'm sure there's going to be people that want to reach out to you, Scott. So I know you mentioned LinkedIn. Is there anything else that an easy way for them to reach out and find you and connect with you and have a conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm pretty active on there. I'm pretty good at responding. I'm with clients a lot of times during the day, so it's a lot of times nights and weekends I'm messaging you back. But the other way is to reach out me direct via email. It's Scott.Kimpland, first name last name at FMI Corp.com. And I'm pretty good about my 24-hour rule. I'll respond to you. If I'm busy, I'll tell you I'm busy, but you'll hear something from me. And yeah, that's probably the easiest way to reach me.
Is that also how they subscribe to your newsletter?
Yeah, if you just email me and tell me you want to be on FMI publishes a ton of data, a ton of reports. We just put out every quarter, we put out our quarterly overview, which is an unbelievable document. But yeah, if you want to kind of get on the list for those kind of things, just ping me with an email. I've got a list. If it dumps too much crap in your inbox, let me know. I'll be glad to turn you off. I don't want to bury somebody in their inbox. I know how many emails I get. So
you're the only newsletter that will check in like with me, and you'll say, is the information I'm sending you valuable? Does it make sense? Do you want to be taken off the list? Tell me now and I'll take you off. Like, how real is that? So I really appreciate the way you go about business, Scott. It's really meaningful. You're making a huge impact in the industry. I appreciate you, being a guest on the show. And please, everyone that's watching or listening right now, please like, subscribe, comment, share the Builder Upper Show with anyone in the industry. And you know what? We'll see you next time. Thank you, Scott.
Lou, thank you very much.
If you're a construction contractor and would like to appear as a guest on our podcast, write us an email. It's lou@lumberfi.com.